I'm sorry that I cut my story short last time. I had some preparations to make. Also, it was getting a bit long, and I don't want you to get disinterested in what I have to say. Like I said before, your life could very well depend on it someday. Anyways, let's get back to it, shall we? I sat in jail for a few days after the officer had come to my grandma's house and taken me away. Being accused of murder is definitely not something you expect to go through in your life, especially when you're only 19 years old. How could they think I'd kill Grandma? I kept asking myself over and over again. Considering I'd grown up visiting this town and I've known several of these people for years, their grandma, it was horrible to see the look of shame and disbelief in their eyes when they stared at me. It was like a knife being wrenched in my gut repeatedly every time it happened. But could they really believe I'd done it? I was able to call my dad the evening after they'd taken me in. They spent hours interrogating me, trying to figure out why I'd done it. But I didn't do it. I told them over and over again what happened. I told them I'd never hurt her and that I had no reason to hurt her. They tried the good cop, bad cop shtick. One trying to say it was just an accident and that I didn't mean for it to happen, while the other would get in my face and straight out say I was a cold-blooded killer who didn't give two shits about her. I'd never wanted to break a man's nose so badly in my life, but I was already in enough hot water and I didn't want to make it worse. I held to my convictions. Eventually, Dad made it the next afternoon to get to the bottom of things. He was informed by the police of what the coroner had found. Blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. When I'd found her, she had been face down, and it didn't really strike me as odd until I was informed of the findings myself during my interrogation. She had been struck from behind by a solid object. With her weakened state, her bone structure was very weak due to the chemo treatments, so it wouldn't have needed too much excessive force to crack her skull open. What it meant was that she had been attacked from behind, but there had been no sign of a break-in, and everything had been locked except for the front door, which I had unlocked while on the phone with the dispatcher. So, of course, with no forced entry, every door and window locked, and a dead woman in a house with only one other occupant, it was obvious to them who suspect number one was. My dad was allowed to see me in the interrogation room. It was a small station by modern standards, so they didn't exactly have anywhere else for accused to speak with family or lawyers without cops being there. "Did you do this? Did you really kill her?" were the first things he asked me. The fact that he didn't ask how I was doing first and foremost means that even he had some suspicion of me. That hurt the most. I calmly told him that I didn't do it. I explained what had happened as far as I knew it. He began to question me more, but it always came back to the same thing. I had been asleep, and I found her by tripping over her body. He still seemed to doubt my story, but he eventually nodded in understanding. He got up, put a hand on my shoulder, and told me, "I'll help bail you out once the amount has been set. We'll figure this out." And with that, he walked out of the room. My arraignment was the following morning. Unfortunately for me, the judge and prosecution both agreed that due to the severity of the situation that I had been accused of, that there would be no bail. I sat there for a moment in disbelief. How could this be happening? I kept repeating that to myself. The despair of the situation was setting in more and more. My grandma was gone, murdered in her home while I was asleep. I failed to protect her, and now I was sitting in jail, labeled a murderer. It was too much to comprehend, too much to bear. But fate, as I'd stated before, is cruel. I still had the dream. On top of everything, that dream still came to me when I closed my eyes. The same eerie forest, the same eclipsing sun, the same sound of the flute echoing into infinity. And that woman, the priestess, it always ended the same way now. My grandma in her bloody bandana and nightgown, standing there with that strange red jewel on her chest, and the word Zetsubou. It was bad enough waking up inside a jail cell. It was worse waking up from that dream in a jail cell. And those whispers. I couldn't stand them anymore. They were starting to haunt every quiet moment of my waking life. Now, I won't bore you with the details of the trial. Needless to say, it was 2 months of hell. The prosecution always trying to point the finger at me, the glares of people that had known me since I was a baby, the loneliness I felt constantly. After every reasoning and excuse had been exhausted, every stone unturned about my past and any possible motives for why I do it, including my psychological health. I never told them about the voices or the nightmares. I didn't want to make them think that I was mentally unstable and had done this due to some psychotic break. Although, even I was starting to question my sanity by this point. However, in the end, due to the lack of evidence, I was set free. No murder weapon and no motive. Now, you would think that getting a not guilty verdict would have been the greatest feeling in the world. I had my freedom back. But that wasn't true. I may have been found not guilty, but the people treated me like I was. Glares followed me wherever I went in that town. The next few weeks after the trial were horrible. Me, Dad, and Mom spent the entire time gathering up Grandma's things and either packing them away or putting them up for sale. I tried to stay outside and help, but every time I approached someone, they either walked away in fear or stared me down with the harshest judgment they could muster. I was a pariah now. I eventually told Dad I'd just stay inside while the sale was going on. Packing up things alone seemed like the better alternative. Although I wasn't exactly alone, the whispers, of course, would still continue. Unclear gibberish rattling off in my ears. Or maybe in my mind. I didn't know anymore. And at that moment, I didn't care. I looked at every piece of my grandma's life I packed away with tears in my eyes. Eventually, I came upon the jewel that I'd gotten Grandma. Its stark, bright, swirly blue reflection bouncing around the walls of the room in the midday sunlight. I decided that I'd keep it as a memento of our last few good days together. I packed it away with a few other assorted items that I'd wanted to keep to remember her by. After everything was said and done, we made our way to the car on the last day, locked up the house, and made our way back home in southern Pennsylvania. Being back in a city setting felt kind of weird. I'd gotten used to the quiet days up north, and being back amongst the noise and hustle just felt alien almost. I'd spent the better part of my life in this city. People I'd grown up with and graduated with were here, and yet I still missed that little borough. But I could never go back there. Not after all that. It felt like being kicked out of paradise almost. A part of my childhood being smothered into oblivion. It wasn't fair. But then again, life is so unfair, isn't it? The next 3 months did nothing to improve that viewpoint. I had trouble finding work, mainly due to the murder charge. But also it just seemed that everything kept going wrong. My car blew a head gasket just as I was supposed to go for an interview, and I had no other way to get there. Obviously, I didn't get that job. Then there was the time I was given the wrong address by the receptionist for a factory job that led me to a vacant lot. So I missed that interview too. Stuff like that kept happening to me. I felt like shit. I was living at home, or rather mooching off of them, as I put it. Hell, After everything that happened, even my friends that I grew up with were leery of being around me now. I thought I could trust them, that they'd believe that I hadn't done it. But it seemed that even though I was found not guilty in a court of law, it was the opposite in public opinion. I was alone. My parents were always away working. My friends had abandoned me, and I had no money aside from what little my parents would spare me. Even they looked at me different now. The only company I had were the whispers. The indecipherable whispers. No matter how many times I tried to talk to them, I never got a response. Was this all in my head? Was I going insane? Those are questions I asked myself every day, and the answer I would always give myself is, I don't know. Maybe I had some kind of mental break. That nightmare appearing every night. Always hearing whispers when no one was around, or even when people were. Maybe I had done it. I started thinking to myself. I began to question whether it was possible that I had done it in my sleep. A situation of sleepwalking gone wrong. Maybe it was all just blocked out by my conscious mind because it was too much for me to handle. I didn't know anymore. All I could do was sit there in my room playing around on my laptop or rolling the jewel around in my hand while thinking about Grandma. Then one day, the doorbell rang. I was home alone as usual, or as alone as I could be by that point. I asked who it was, and on the other side of the door was the voice of a woman. My stomach turned when she identified herself as a detective. The last time a cop came to my door, I was arrested and taken away on murder charges. I reluctantly opened the door, and there stood a woman, a bit thick in build, but not much taller than me. Her brown hair up in a tight bun and her hazel eyes looking at me. "Can I help you, detective?" I asked. She asked if I was Dean, and once I told her that I was, her expression softened a bit. "I'm sorry, but I have some terrible news to give you. Your parents were in a car accident. Neither of them made it out. I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air for a moment. They're dead?" was all I was able to get out. The detective nodded, and all I could do was slump down to the floor. I sat there barely moving as the detective crouched down next to me. "Dean, I need you to come with me. We need you to identify the bodies, and we want to ask you a few questions." Absent-mindedly, I nodded and got to my feet. Everything was a blur after that. Leaving my house, the drive to the morgue, and the trip into the building. We reached the room, and she stood me in front of a glass window. Inside were two gurneys, each with a body concealed by a white sheet. The doctor walked into the room and removed the one closest to the window. There lay my mother, or what I could barely tell was my mother. Her face was banged up pretty bad. Her nose was broken. Skin was peeled away from her face in places, and what skin was there was bruised to hell. But it was her, no doubt. "That's my mom," I told the detective. She nodded to the doctor, and my mom was covered again. Before the doctor even pulled the sheet back off the next body, I already knew it would be my dad. His left ear was completely gone, and gouges were all over his face from where glass had cut into it. His lips had even been taken off by the impact, and what was left of his teeth lay there exposed. It was gruesome, and my stomach was almost unable to handle it, but the shock of the situation had numbed most of my body. I told the detective that was him, and she again nodded to the doctor. As the doctor was covering my dad back up, I noticed the back of his head was cracked open. Something about that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't figure out why, though. Maybe it was because of what happened with Grandma, I thought to myself. The detective sat me down outside in the hall. She walked over with a cup of water and sat down next to me. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said. Her sincerity was noticeable, and after months of not getting anything other than suspicion and bile, it was nice to have some genuine affection from another human being. I nodded to her and took a sip of water. She started asking me questions about my parents, mainly my dad. He had been the one driving when the crash happened. There were no other cars involved when he wrecked. According to witnesses, he was driving along the highway when suddenly he just veered off into the median. He crossed 2 lanes of high-speed traffic, missing everyone else as he did, luckily. And then the car slammed into the guardrail, flipping several times. They were both declared dead at the scene. She asked me if Dad was a heavy drinker or if he abused drugs of any kind. I said no to both questions. My dad was as straight edge as you could get. A glass of wine once or twice a year was the most he ever had. And drugs, you can forget about. He didn't like taking prescription medication at times for fear of getting addicted. After a few more routine questions, she told me that she'd drive me back home so I could make preparations. We arrived back at my parents' house, or I guess my house at that moment, and she handed me her card. She told me I could call her if I needed anything or had any questions. Before she left, though, I did ask her a question. I noticed that the back of my dad's head had been cracked open. How is it that he suffered head trauma like that and my mom didn't? She shrugged and said, "It's hard to say. With a wreck at 60 miles per hour, it's hard to figure out what kind of damage would be done to a human body in a car accident. The only strange thing was that the wound was caused by something cylindrical. We're still looking into it since the coroner couldn't figure out how he would have gotten an injury like that since neither were ejected from the car." She wished me well and went on her way. I went back inside the house, and sure enough, the whispers were back. My mind started to hit realization of what had happened. I broke down after I locked the door. I cried for what felt like hours. Why was this happening to me? Was all I could ask myself. First Grandma, and now my parents. But things got worse that night. I passed out after having several of the beers Mom had left in the fridge. And by several, I mean about 9 or 10. I laid on my bed in a drunken stupor and slowly faded to sleep. That damn forest. I was there again. The emotions repeated like they had for the last 3 months. Pink, red, and purple leaves falling from the assorted trees of the forest as I walked. The sky, though, was darker than it had been in the past. I reached the clearing as I always did and approached the solitary stump in the middle. I sat there, and this time as I looked up, the sun was almost completely eclipsed now. The sound of the flute echoed around me as I lowered my head. The priestess was there, like always. Her brown and green garments flowing in the breeze as she played her haunting melody on her bamboo flute. She approached me, almost flowing like a boat over water, never breaking eye contact with me. She reached me as she always did and stood there for a moment, pulling the flute from her lips. She shifted her gaze up to my right, and as she had for the last 3 months, there stood my grandma. The red jewel prominent on her chest. I looked back to the priestess, and that's when things changed once again for the first time since the night my grandma was murdered. She looked to my left this time, and as I followed her stare, I was greeted by the horrific sight of my parents. They looked just like they did at the morgue. My dad standing there in his red 3-button polo shirt and jeans, left ear completely gone, and his damaged skeletal grin staring back at me. My mother and her shredded face that once held such grace looking at me through dead gray eyes and a different expression on her face. And just like Grandma, on their chest they each had a red jewel. I turned my focus back to the priestess, and just as she always did, she placed the end of the flute to my forehead and said, "Zetsubou." The chills that hit me when I woke up covered in sweat were fierce. I wiped my forehead with my hand and started to stand up. I didn't make it very far before sitting back down on the floor. I was slightly hungover, and popping up the way I had didn't help things. The room started to spin, so I just laid down on the floor and closed my eyes for a moment. The voices again, and with the throbbing headache I had it worse than usual. It sounded almost like screaming. It got so loud. After about 20 minutes, I decided to get up and get on my computer. That word, that damn word, I heard for the last 3 months every night. I needed to know what it meant. So I went to work and I Googled it. I tried spelling the word as best I could, considering I'd never heard the word before the dream started, and I don't know Japanese. It took a couple of tries, but I came upon the correct spelling. Zetsubou was Japanese for despair. She had been telling me despair every night for 3 months. It's just ridiculous. How could I be having a recurring dream that has a priestess telling me despair for so long? I didn't know the meaning of the word until just now. What was going on here? Before I got any deeper in trying to figure out this dream, I had to deal with a few things that needed my attention. The next week was spent setting up my parents' funeral arrangements. Not something a child should have to do at 19. But there was no one else that could do it. I had one uncle, but he and his family lived overseas on a military base, so they wouldn't be making it out here until the day of the funeral. I was left to do this alone. It was difficult, and I don't want to go through the entire painful process here. My uncle invited me to come live with him and his family overseas at the base in Okinawa. He had talked with his superiors about the situation, and they gave him permission to do so. I took him up on the offer since, well, things here weren't improving, and maybe a change of scenery and country would be nice. Maybe I could find a job on base. I just knew I couldn't stay here anymore, and maybe I could figure out something more about this dream. It took a couple of weeks to get everything in order with my parents' estate. I ended up with a decent sum of funds as well as all the possessions in the house. I picked out the things I wished to keep and anything my uncle and his family wished to take, and sent the rest on a truck to the Salvation Army. I had no use for it, and I didn't want to deal with all of this anymore. I needed to get away. I needed answers. The house would be put up for sale later on, and whether it's sold or not, I don't know yet. All I know is that the flight there was nice, and it almost felt like I had a new lease on life. I looked out the window of the flight while I had the jewel in my hand. My uncle looked at me and asked what it was. I recounted the story of how I'd bought it for my grandma at a trader's market when I was up there living with her months earlier. The little Japanese woman who had sold it to me and told me it was a charm of serenity and peace. Of course, I've had nothing but the complete opposite of peace and serenity for half a year now, I told him, letting a sigh escape my mouth as I did. The sun caught the jewel as I was holding it, and its swirling, vibrant blue light shined inside the cabin of the plane. It caught the attention of a few people, including the flight attendant, and I was asked to put it away. I did so and resumed enjoying the flight the rest of the way. It took a few days for things to reach the house on base. Security is pretty tight after all. But eventually we got everything in, thanks to the help of my uncle and younger cousins. Once my computer was set up, I took to the internet and started looking up information on the priestess from the dreams. I figured maybe it was just some anime I had watched when I was younger that I'd just forgotten about. However, when I typed in the information, priestess plus Zetsubou plus dreams, I found an entry at the very top of the page with information surprisingly on what I was looking for. So I clicked on the link and it took me to this old site. It looked like it hadn't been updated in years. It was an old folklore site with stories of all types from different countries. The link, however, didn't take me to the main page, but directly to one specific entry. Tenman-niso no Mugen was the name of the entry. It roughly translated to Demon Priestess of Dreams. It had a crude picture which wasn't in the best shape. Apparently information on this thing had mostly been lost to history as there wasn't too much information. Luckily for me, though, I learned all that I needed. The legend goes that there was a group of 5 women who took on the roles of priestesses in an offshoot sect of Shinto beliefs, one of the few that didn't survive. They believed in the carnal pleasures of the world, and that the woods were a place of spiritual bliss. Their shrine was a hotbed of sodomy, perversion, gambling, opiates, and sake. These 5 women were treated horribly after they had been inducted into the shrine, and eventually this led to horrible consequences for them. Beaten, raped, and tortured by the men and women that would travel to the shrine, and by the Shinto priests as well. However, unbeknownst to the priests, the 5 women each made their ways into the forest on a dark night in the spring. They prayed under the cherry blossoms of the forest in a clearing near the shrine and prayed for safety from the horrors inside. Their prayers were answered by a yokai that wandered the forest. The yokai looked at the 5 women and with a grin offered them a chance to exact revenge on the people in the shrine, but that in return, they would serve him for eternity. After some convincing, they accepted, and he was able to warp them into powerful yokai. They gained the power to enter people's dreams, and through them fill the person with feelings of rage, sexual frustration, avarice, or despair. Once they had picked a person to torture, they would haunt their minds every night with a recurring dream. Some accounts talked of a burning forest where the dead hang from the branches of trees, as well as the dreamer, and a horde of oni who would wield a mighty blade to strike them down. As a woman played a shamisen, a stringed instrument similar to a banjo. Other accounts would talk about being strung up in the forest by your arms against a tree trunk while your feet were tethered to the base, during which a group of women or men would gather around you completely naked and begin to titillate you or beat you, while a woman would be seen nearby playing a tsuzumi, which is an hourglass-shaped drum played with one hand while resting one end on your shoulder. The last account told of a forest of quiet loneliness where leaves from every season fell at once, and the sun overhead would eclipse behind many dark clouds. Eventually the person would end up in a clearing where a woman would be seen playing the hochiku, a vertical bamboo flute. That was it, I thought to myself. I'd found what I was looking for. The entry continued, stating how the shrine was eventually burnt to the ground after many strange deaths began occurring. Some seemed to be self-inflicted, while others seemed to be murders, although no one person could ever be fully blamed for the suspected murders, which would consist of either strangulation, disembowelment, or severe wounds from the back of the head. People believed that it was the power of strong evil spirits that had brought about this horror, and so Shinto priests from a neighboring village came and set up a ritual. They trapped the 5 demon priestesses inside jewels. Each were clear spheres with unique striping patterns that represented the evil energies of the yokai held within, the evil visible for all to see. While beautiful in appearance, they held great evil and were sealed away in a shrine. The entry finished by stating that the shrine that had contained them was ransacked sometime during the late 1700s, and many sacred and cursed items were lost, the 5 jewels among them. They went on to state that rumors of the jewels being sold by old women to unsuspecting travelers as charms of positive energy had been reported over many years, and that some believed the old women were the manifestation of the priestesses, luring in new victims in retribution for their captivity. If a person was in possession of one, the whispers of those that had fallen victim to the jewels would follow them. Bad luck would befall them by the hands of the yokai inhabiting the jewel, and they would be haunted by the evil dreams at night, committing horrible atrocities in a trance-like state until they succumbed to the will of the yokai and were devoured themselves. I sat there staring at the computer screen for what seemed like an hour. My skin began to crawl and my hands began to shake. A chill ran down my spine from the base of my neck down to my tailbone. The whispers began to hammer my mind, and my head began to throb. I slowly turned away from my computer and looked across the room at the nightstand next to my bed. There sat the jewel, catching the moonlight and reflecting its swirling blue light. A cursed jewel that contained a yokai. Everything started to make sense. The dreams, the whispers, even the death of my grandma and parents. It was her. The demon priestess. All the bad things that had been happening to me for half a year now were all because of her. I'd fallen for the bait that had doomed countless people to a living hell. I quickly looked back to the computer and tried looking over the entry. There has to be a way to stop this. There has to be, I said to myself over and over again as I looked over the entry, but I found nothing. It seemed that it was something that was impossible to stop. I was screwed. beyond any measure of doubt, I was fucking screwed. The worst part was that, in a way, the deaths of my loved ones were my fault. She used them to bring me despair. Loneliness. She was weakening my will and trying to quash any and all hope and happiness until I would be vulnerable to her whims. Her and that damned flute. She'll haunt me until the day I die. That's when a thought popped into my head. It wasn't the most pleasant thought, but seeing as the alternative was leaving things as they were and having it escalate, it felt like I had no other choice. And that leads us to now. At this moment, I've been putting all of this information on my computer at my uncle's house and placed it online. This will be the last time anyone hears from me. You see, I figured out that this will never stop until I'm dead, so, well, I'm going to make that happen sooner than later. 3 people have already died because of my actions, and I can't stomach thinking that more will. Those preparations I mentioned at the beginning of this entry were me renting out a boat from one of the nearby harbors off base. It's a nice personal boat and decently big. I'm going to take it out into the ocean, as far as I can without leaving the boat to be taken away by the tides. I'm also going to take a handy little revolver that I purchased from a guy in one of the neighboring cities. Lucky for me, black markets exist everywhere. Once I'm out far enough at sea, I'm going to toss the jewel as far as I can. I'm going to let it sink into the inky black depths and hopefully leave its evil to lay there forever. However, I can't account for the other 4 jewels, and they're likely out there. That's been the entire point of this. A warning to all of you. If you find yourself out in the world and you happen upon a little Japanese woman with a clear palm-sized jewel with streaking colors swirling inside it, a jewel that when caught by sunlight or moonlight gives off a shimmering effect of swirling colors, walk away. Reject the offer. Forget you ever saw it. She is not what she seems. She will lie to you. If you take her offer, you will be cursed. Take it from me. You don't want to experience this nightmarish scenario. It's a nice autumn evening, and the ocean looks calm. I've left a last will and testament for my uncle and his family, leaving everything I've got from my parents to them. It's a decent chunk of money, and my little cousins should enjoy my things. It was nice having kindness again at the end of it all. But now, it's time to end this. The whispers are louder than they've ever been. I think they know something is up. Or maybe it's her. The demon priestess will get my soul, but it will be the last one she ever gets. I hope it was worth it for her. The whispers will take me to my grave. They will be my chorus, and in the end, I will leave nothing else but the final whispers of my actions. The last moments of my life will be nothing more than echoes in the night.